Hi everyone, let's make a start. I'm Martin Goodson from the sponsors of the meetup, Evolution AI. Welcome to the machine learning meetup. We have David Ha joining us today from Google Brain. He's in Tokyo, so there's a bit of a time difference, but thanks very much. Thanks very much, David, for making the effort to join us today. Let's jump straight in. Over to you, David. Oh, one thing I should say is that the QA will happen at the end of David's talk. So please do put your questions into the QA, and then we will address them at the end of the talk. So, sorry about that, David. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, thanks for the kind introduction. Hi everyone. My name is David Ha. I'm a researcher at Google, and I'm really delighted to be here virtually. In this talk, I'm going to give a brief survey about how ideas from collective intelligence can be applied to AI and maybe machine learning research. So, if you've been following the developments in machine learning over the past few years, I'm sure all of you have, you may have noticed that some of the advances of artificial neural networks, these are amazing advances, and they're used for more and more applications. For example, from image classification using deep neural networks to now image generation using GAN, VAEs, and more recently, diffusion models and text to images. They're also used in machine translation and also in large language models like BERTs and GPT. They can also be used for things like transcribing voice dialogues and also generating sounds. Recently, they've also been applied to these NERF models that can stitch together real photographs based on coordinates and angles and reconstruct things that look like, well, a map of San Francisco or any other city that you may have data for. So, but with all of these advances, the impressive feats in deep learning involves a lot of sophisticated engineering design. Like many of us here work in deep learning, and it's a very applied discipline, and all of us have our share of architecture selection, hyperparameter tuning. As much of these auto ML tools can offer us, we still need to do a lot. Like for instance, even in this famous AlexNet architecture, which made deep learning famous when it won the ImageNet competition 10 years ago now. Wow, it's been 10 years. And we can see that the details that were involved in this design, there's lots of design choices that were made back then. And modern networks are even more sophisticated, like even today. And they require a pipeline that spans not only neural network architecture, that could be probably the most simplest thing, but also more very careful training schemes. Like it's like a selecting the learning rate decay or whatever. It's like a black arts, or if anything. So there's lots of sweat and labor that had to go into producing these amazing results. Just look at the appendix of NeurIPS papers, and you can see pages and pages of details of the tricks needed to get something to work. So recently, I've been fascinated with all of these text-to-image models like OpenAI's DALL-E 2, Google's Imagen, and more recently, like Stable Diffusion. They demonstrate how effective deep learning networks are as a large neural data sponge that can absorb huge amounts of data into the parameters of the neural networks, like the weights, and work with the data in non-trivial ways. Like text to image is a form of image retrieval, or kind of like an image compression, sort of neural compression, so to speak, for image generation. But under the hood of these amazing models, there's a lot of involved details that's like the researchers and engineers had to develop. Like if you look at the section of one of these papers about diffusion models, there's many like tricks as in how to solve for the number of steps for diffusion, how to bound the levels of the colors, and there's all of these different parameters or different aspects to these models that have to be carefully chosen in order to get the amazing results that we can see right now. So, as part of this this talk, I want to kind of give us a different perspective, sidetrack and step a bit back from our current trajectory in deep learning. So one of the themes that I want to talk about in this talk is that I believe that the way we're currently doing deep learning is like engineering. No, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think we're building neural network systems the way we're building bridges and buildings, even by design. So I really like this quote from Andrew Pickering in a book that describes the history of cybernetics, where he says, bridges and buildings are all designed to be indifferent to their environments, to withstand fluctuations, but not to adapt to them. So the best bridge is one that just stands there, whatever the weather. But in natural systems, where collective intelligence plays a big role, we see complex designs that emerge due to self-organization. Like for example, like the classical ants building a bridge. So like in such designs, these are usually like sensitive and responsive to changes in the world around them. They can adapt. So natural systems can adapt and become part of their environments, not become a thing that is distinct from the environments. So it didn't have to be this way. So all of our progress took this direction, but I think it didn't have to be this way. So this is a bit of a historical perspective. The reason deep learning took its course could be just like potentially just an accidents in history, or like it's so random how things, how technology develops. There's no right or wrong. It's just the way it happened. But in fact, in the very early days of neural network development, even before Schmidhuber's days, from the 1980s, many groups, including a group led by Leon Chua, who's the legendary electrical engineer, worked on neural networks that are much closer to natural adaptive systems. So for example, in here, they developed something called cellular neural networks, which are kind of artificial neural network circuits with grids of artificial neurons back in the early 1980s. So each of these neurons would receive signals from their neighbors, perform a weighted sum operation that we all know, and apply a nonlinear activation, just like how we do today, and send off a signal to its neighbors. But this was done in the 80s. The difference between these networks and today's networks is that they were built using analog circuits, meaning that they would only work approximately, but at the same time, much faster than digital circuits at the time. Also, the wiring of each cell is exactly the same. So they're very modular. So what's remarkable is that even in the late 1980s, they have shown that these networks can produce amazing results, like even like object extraction from this example here. These analog cellular networks can work in nanoseconds back in the 80s or 90s, something that we were only able to match decades later using digital circuits and GPUs. So they can be programmed to do non-trivial things, like here, selecting all objects in a pixel image that are like pointing up and erasing all the other objects. We were only able to do these tasks decades later with deep learning. But in the last few years, I have been noticing in my research every day, in the deep learning research pop up, that have been using some of these ideas from collective intelligence, in particular, the area of emergent complex systems. So recently, we even wrote a survey paper about these works, which I will discuss here. The problem is that collective intelligence or complex systems is a huge topic, including topics that investigate the behavior of things like actual honeybees and real ant colonies. So in this talk, we will limit our discussion in only some areas focused on deep learning. In our survey paper, we cover areas like image processing, generative models, deep RL, multi-agent learning, and meta-learning. And this is what this talk will be about. So I'll start by discussing the idea of image generation from a collective intelligence standpoint. This is kind of fun. One example I can think of is this annual Reddit R-place experiments. In this annual experiments, the Reddit has a subreddit that sets up a 1,000 by 1,000 pixel canvas. So there's 1,000,000 pixels here. But they only allow each Reddit user to draw a single pixel every 5 minutes. So this experiment lasts for 1 week, allowing millions of Reddit users to draw whatever they want. But to make something meaningful, users actually have to collaborate with each other and coordinate on a strategy on the Reddit discussion forums in order to do things like defend the design and also like the mischievously attack other designs, and they have to form alliances with other groups. Just like it's like a simplified model of human civilization. So what's interesting is early algorithms also computed designs on a pixel grid. The example that we can all think of of cellular automata is this Conway's game of life, where the state of each pixel on a grid is computed based on a function that depends on the states of its neighbor pixels, like whether they are alive or dead, from the previous time step. And it's based on like simple rules. And based on these simple rules, these complex patterns can emerge. A recent work, maybe not recent anymore, 2 years ago, called a neurocellular automata, tried to extend the concept of CAs, cellular automatas, but replace the simple rules like in Conway's game of life with a neural network. So in a sense, neural CAs are really similar to the cellular neural networks from the 1980s that I discussed earlier. But in this work, they apply neural CAs to image generation, 1 pixel at a time, stochastically somewhere on the screen. It's kind of like the Reddit R-place example that I talked about, where at each time step, a pixel will be randomly chosen and updated on a canvas based on the output of a single neural network function, whose inputs are only the values of the pixel's nearby immediate neighbors. Over time, they show that the neural cellular automata, the neural CA, can be trained to output any particular given design based on this sparse stochastic sampling rule from an almost empty initial canvas. So here are some examples of 3 neural CAs producing 3 designs. What's I think is remarkable with this method is that when we see some corruption in the image, the algorithm would attempt to regenerate the corrupted part automatically in its own way. So it might not exactly recover it, but it does attempt to do it in some sort of a logical or like a logical way to fulfill what it believes this broken emoji or butterfly example is. But sometimes it does mess up if it's too corrupt. So neural CAs can also perform prediction tasks in a collective fashion. For a very simple example, like here, one of the papers showed that neural CAs can be applied to classify MNIST digits, the simplest classification, image classification task. But the difference here compared to what we usually do when we classify MNIST is that each pixel must produce its own prediction based on its own pixels and the predictions from its immediate neighbors, so that like its own predictions will have some sort of influence of the predictions of its neighbors and change their opinions over time, like in democratic society. So rather than having one classifier for 28 by 28 pixel, you would literally have 784 classifiers running together, and each classifier is based on the decisions made by the pixel's immediate neighbor, like the 8 neighbors. So over time, usually some consensus is made across the collection of pixels, But interestingly, sometimes we see these effects, like if the digit was written in a weird way, there would be different steady states of predictions across different regions of the digit. So I played around with this web demo, and you can write really weird digits, and you're able to see these warring states trying to fight over whether it's a 2 or a 7, and so on. So neural CAs are not confined to generating pixels. They can also generate voxels as a natural extension and 3D shapes. So some of the follow-up recent work even used neural CAs to produce designs in Minecraft, like a voxel game, which are kind of like pixels, but voxels, a 3D version. They can also produce things like buildings and trees. But what's most interesting in this work is that since some components in Minecraft are active rather than passive, meaning they can move, they can also generate functional machines with behavior. So here, this work shows that even when one of these functional machines, like a worm, gets cut in half, each half can regenerate itself morphogenetically, that's the term they use, to end up with two functional machines that are not exactly the same, because there's some noise in this process, but they can all still walk forward. So I thought that this is kind of cool. So another popular area within deep learning is DeepRL, which is to train neural networks with reinforcement learning for tasks like locomotion control. So here are a few examples of these Mujoko humanoid benchmark environments and their so-called state-of-the-art solutions. What happens is that for like all of the input states, in the case of the humanoid, we actually have around like 370 observations or so. They're all fed into a single deep neural network, the policy network. And this policy network will output all 17 actions required to control the joints of the humanoid for it to move forward. So what usually happens is that these networks tend to overfit the training environment. So you end up with solutions that only work for this exact design and environments, or like maybe a very small deviation, but like it's pretty overfit to this kind of environments. But we've seen some pretty cool works recently that uses a collective controller approach for these problems. In particular, in this paper, rather than having one policy network take all of the inputs and output all of the actions, here they use a single shared policy network for every joint in the agents, effectively decomposing an agent into a collection of identical agents connected by limbs. So these policies can communicate bidirectionally only with their neighbors. And over time, through the training, a global policy somehow miraculously emerges just from this local coordination, which I find really interesting. So not only do they train this single policy for one agent design, it must work across dozens of designs in a training set. So here, every one of these agents are controlled by the same policy that governs each joint. So no matter the morphology, there's only like one controller for all of these joints. So as at the joint level, not at the agent's level. Well, they show that this type of collective systems has some zero-shot generalization capabilities and can also control agents with not only different design variations with different limb lengths and masses, but also novel designs not in the training set. So there's some element of generalization going on, and they can deal with unseen challenges. So why rely on a fixed design? Another work here looks at why not have limbs figure out a way to self-assemble into some like new design or some specific tailored design to perform tasks like balancing and locomotion. So we don't need to even have a design pre-made. So in this work, it showed that this approach of having limbs self-assemble, this approach can generalize to cases even when you have double or half the number of lengths, the limbs in the system, something that's simply not possible with traditional deep RL. Even a system trained with traditional deep RL would work for a fixed number of limbs. The self-assembling solutions consistently prove to be more robust to unseen challenges like wind, or in the case of locomotion, handle new types of terrain such as hurdles or going up the stairs. That's like the vanilla RL, the train agents fail to do, but the self-assembly agents has this generalization capability. So this type of collective policy making can also be applied to image-based reinforcement learning tasks too. In a recent neuroscience paper from the end of last year from my group, we looked at feeding each patch from a video feed into an identical sensory neuron units. And these sensory neurons must figure out the context of its own channel and then self-organize using an attention mechanism for communication to collectively output motor commands for the agents. So this will allow the agents to still work even when the patches on the screen are all shuffled and reshuffled during the rollup, during the life of the agents. This work is inspired by the idea of sensory substitution, where different parts of the brain can be retrained to process different sensory modalities, enabling us to be able to adapt our senses to crucial information sources. So as an example applied to a locomotion task like this ants agent, we can shuffle the ordering of the 28 inputs quite frequently during the rollout. And our agents, as we see here, will quickly adjust to a dynamic observation space. We can even get the agents to play this shuffled or puzzle Pong game, where the patches are constantly shuffled and reshuffled during the game. What I thought is interesting is that we've discovered, or we showed that the system can also work with partial information, like with only 70% of patches, which are all shuffled and reshuffled. We find some unexpected benefits from the system too, like the ability to work with different background that it hasn't seen during training. So in this environment, it's only seen the green shades of grass, but it can generalize to different backgrounds. So the earlier RL examples I mentioned were mainly about decomposing single agents into a collection of smaller collection of agents. But what we do know from complex systems is that this concept of emergence often occurs at much larger scales than 10 to 20 agents. Typically of multi-agent RL work is like 2 to 5 agents, but we need a collection of thousands or more individual agents to interact meaningfully for these complex superorganisms to emerge. A few years back, there was a paper that looked at taking advantage of GPUs, hardware accelerators, to enable significant scaling up of multi-agent reinforcement learning. In this work called M-Agents, the authors proposed a framework to get up to 1 million agents, although pretty simple ones like grid world, to engage in various grid world multi-agent environments. And furthermore, they can have one population of agent pit against another population of agent in a collective self-play manner. So this hardware revolution brought about by deep learning can enable us to take advantage of the hardware and use them to train truly large-scale collective behavior. In some of these experiments, they observe predator-prey loops, encirclement tactics emerge from this large-scale multi-agent RL. These macro-level collective intelligence will probably not emerge from traditional small-scale multi-agent environment that involves only like 2 to 4 or even 10 agents. So I would like to note that this work was from 2018. And as we all know, hardware acceleration progress has only exponentially increased since then. A recent demo from NVIDIA showcased a physics engine that can handle thousands of agents acting inside a realistic physics simulation, unlike that simple grid world environment. So I believe that in the future, we could see really interesting studies of emergent behavior using these newer technologies. These are really amazing. And as we have more memory and more GPU capability roll out, we should be able to do much larger, realistic collective experiments. I would like to end with a discussion of how collective behavior is being applied or can be applied to the subfield of meta-learning. So these increases in compute capabilities won't stop at simulation. Like, we all know that simple MNIST classification network requires not much hardware, since our concept of artificial neural networks are simply weight matrices between nodes with a nonlinear activation function. But with extra compute, we can also explore really interesting directions where we can simulate generalized versions of neural nets, where perhaps every neuron is an identical multi-layer neural network. So I remember seeing some neuroscience papers actually exploring this theme, where the authors claim that every biological neuron or synapse should be modeled by large artificial neural network. But rather than neurons, though, recently we have seen some pretty ambitious works modeling like something like at the synapse level as a recurrent neural network. This is because when we look at how a standard neural network is trained, we go through the forward pass of the network to forward propagate the inputs of the network to the output. And then we use the back propagation algorithm to backprop the error signals back from the output layer all the way to the input layer. And from this process, we can use the gradients to adjust the weights every time we do this. So that's how traditional learning works for artificial neural networks. But in this work, rather than relying on this forward and back propagation, we can model each synapse of a neural network with an RNN, which is a universal computer. And the authors show that these RNNs can learn how to do forward and back propagation. They can forward and back propagate through the signals, and hence they can learn how to learn. The hidden states of each RNN would essentially define what the weights are in a highly plastic way. So these works, they have actually shown that these approaches can be seen as a generalization of backprop. And in fact, one of the papers have experimentally trained these meta-learning networks to exactly replicate the backpropagation operation, and they can be trained to perform the exact stochastic gradient descents. But I think more importantly, that's just to show that it's a generalization of SGD. These algorithms, these meta-learning algorithms, can evolve or learn new learning rules that can learn more efficiently than SGD or even Adam. But in one experiment, they trained this type of meta-learning system called a variable shared meta-learner, the blue line, to learn a learning rule using only the MNIST datasets, where the learning rule here outperforms backprop and like SGD and Adam baseline, which we expect since the learning rule is fine-tuned to the MNIST data set. But when they test the learning rule on a new data set, like fashion MNIST, they can see performance gains, or even then over SGD or ADAM. So I think these works are still in their very early stages, but I think these approaches of modeling neural networks as a truly collective set of identical neurons or synapse, rather than this fixed unique weights, will be a really promising research direction that can change the subfield of meta-learning, or perhaps even complement existing large networks if they have a layer of these smart neurons that can adapt, and the large foundation models, whatever you call them, can be a form of a long-term memory that doesn't change. So, as an aside, I think yeah, there is a lot of potential in combining existing approaches for where we can currently train very large networks, with these type of approaches. So I don't think it's really like going everything into the collective intelligence method or not. I think these are different approaches that may potentially complement each other. So in summary, in this talk, I describe how collective intelligence can really help move the needle in machine learning. I've shown examples where systems can adapt to its environments. Many of these methods are robust to out of distribution shifts, have some form of generalization. And I believe that these collective systems are a key ingredient for systems that can learn to learn. So if you want to read more about this, there's our survey paper called Collective Intelligence for Deep Learning, a survey of recent development. And this has been accepted and will be published in the ACM Journal of Collective Intelligence, which should be launched in the middle of next month. Okay, thank you. This ends my talk portion.